Welcome to the herd and thanks for listening. If you enjoy this sodcast, please like it, share it, give it a good rating, and follow, and help more people find their way into the Ruminati herd. If you have suggestions for improvements, please let me know. Howdy, everybody. Welcome to this episode of the Meet Your Herdmates sodcast. I'm pleased today to be joined by Dr. Paul Beck from Oklahoma State University. Welcome.
Well, welcome, Peter. It's very good to be on here, and thank you for the invitation to speak on your podcast.
My pleasure. So you received degrees in animal science from Oklahoma State University, bachelor's and master's of science.
Yes, sir.
And then, but you grew up on a ranch, farm and ranch operation. Is that correct?
Yeah, I was raised about 30 miles from here in Stillwater, where I'm currently located. I always intended to remain here my entire life, but about 22 years ago, I had an opportunity to continue my education in Arkansas. So moving, from the beginnings of the West, where we start getting into drier, arid climates, into the deep South, it was quite a change. But spent 20 years there and got my Ph.D. and really enjoyed our time in Arkansas before I had a chance to move back to Oklahoma.
Yeah, but you didn't go into a doctoral program where you were on assistantship. You were working as a herdsman at a research station. Is that correct?
That's correct. I was located at Hope, Arkansas, at their Southwest research station, 4 hours from campus. And I was originally hired to be a herdsman, or the animal unit manager, for a substantial cow-calf herd that they have there. We did cow-calf, stocker cattle, and some finishing research while I was there. So we look at all aspects of the beef production system from that station in southern Arkansas. And while I was there, I was given the opportunity to do my Ph.D. It took about 6 years instead of 3 to complete my degree. There was a lot of driving associated with that to get to campus to take classes. That was before we had this wonderful technology of being able to remotely educate from experts across the world. Then whenever I finished my PhD there, there was a faculty position at that same research station that came open, and I was able to just stay right there for right at 14 years as a faculty member. So in total, I was there 21 years.
And then 2 years plus or so ago, you got to go home?
Yep, right at 2 years ago, August of 2018, we moved back to Stillwater. Got a extension specialist job based here on campus, where I was focusing more primarily on forages and grazing livestock nutrition. I'm still doing some of that, but my main focus is nutrition, both confined cattle feeding and grazing livestock nutrition as well here in Oklahoma.
And this, so we've already talked about cow-calf versus stocker versus finishing, and frequently people will ask me questions about why doesn't the cattle industry do X, Y, or Z. It implies to me that people think about this vertically integrated, uniform industry that's wherever it occurs, and the beef cattle production practices look very different depending on where you are, and then there are various segments of that industry. So could you just give us a brief description of cow calf versus, or maybe even take us through a life cycle?
Yeah. So cow calf is kind of the factory of the beef production system. They produce the raw product, which is the calves. Those calves are produced in a large part from Oklahoma and Texas east into the Southeastern United States. Right now, the three biggest cow-calf states are Texas, Oklahoma, and usually it's either Missouri or Nebraska is the third. But when we look at where the cows are located, or the concentration of cows are located in Oklahoma and Texas, it's east of I-35. So there's a large number of cows in the more humid part of those states, and there's a lot of cows throughout the Southeastern United States. Those states, they're really good at producing grass, forages, and you can grow, forages for a long period of time through the year. So that climate, we can grow grass and keep cattle out on pasture, for 10 months, 12 months a year with management. It's not a good place to fatten cattle. In the United States, our finishing system that has been developed over the last 75 years is based on getting those cattle off from the cow, and they get put either into a growing program or stalker program where they're grazed to get to heavier weights, or sent directly to the feedlot and fed high concentrate or grain-based and byproduct-based diets to finish them or fatten them to where they can express that marbling and make that tender, cut that people, really love when they think about American beef. So to concentrate cattle and feed them, these high grain diets, you need a really dry climate. And it really needs to be to where they can remain cool and not be too cold through the winter. So the high plains in the further western region of Texas, Oklahoma Panhandle, western Kansas, and western Nebraska, that's where the cattle are fattened predominantly in our southern Great Plains or in the Great Plains states. So the beef production system is not just one uniform system. It's very disjointed and very segmented based on the climate that's best suited for the production of that stage of production for those animals. And so that creates a lot of opportunity to move those cattle and different types of operations to fit. And Oklahoma is in that transition zone from the humid east going into the arid west. It's also, for one reason or another, in the transition zone from cow-calf into stalker and finishing. So it's uniquely situated, kind of in that middle ground, not too far south where it gets so hot, not too far north where we can't grow forages for a long period of time through the year. We're uniquely situated for growing cattle, cow-calf, and finishing cattle.
And so hopefully every year we get to wean a live calf from the cow. Hopefully she gave us a calf and hopefully it survived. Not all the time, not 100%, but the goal is 90% of the time to wean a calf. So from birth to weaning is 5-6 months, or
it's the book is right at 7 months.
7 months.
So the range of age, if we have a really tight controlled calving season. With, the cow herd I managed in Arkansas, we had a 60-day calving season. So we would wean at an average age of right at 210 days. But on either end of that, they could be, 9 months old or 6 months old. A lot of our producers have quite a bit longer calving season. So, the range is fairly close to that, 5 to 10 months of age when we really start looking at, those calves being weaned and removed from the cow.
So hopefully the producers are aligning the reproductive cycle and therefore the nutritional demands of the cow up with their forage resource to minimize supplemental feeding.
Yeah. So, as an extension specialist, whenever I talk to producers, we try to fit the type of cow to your environment. And that is the size of the cow, how much milk that cow will produce. But also, we need to fit our calving season to our environment, just so that we can, like you say, minimize supplemental feeding, minimize hay feeding, and have a forage-based program. It's when we get away from matching our biology to the environment that we really get into problems with, having to feed too much and lack of profitability. We can do that for a short while and in good prices. But having, our production, our biology, to where it's dovetailed with our environment, then, we can have a sustainable system that is profitable and productive.
So I think, I don't know where I heard this, but the idea was that the feed you graze is cheaper than what gets delivered on a truck.
Absolutely. It's probably, if it's managed well, it's of the same or higher quality than what we can deliver. Most of our grain growing forages are, provide as much energy as corn would, but have more protein. And, it's calories and protein and the minerals that the cattle need to be productive. Now in most cases, our forages don't meet the mineral needs, but, if we have a grazing system, designed with multiple different, forages, then, we can meet that energy and protein requirements of, whatever cow we're trying to fit into that system.
Well, so just to touch base on one thing before I forget it again, we talk about fattening cattle, but in fact, they're still growing muscle, and to a certain extent, it's not merely fat that's being deposited on an animal when it's in a finishing phase.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Whenever we look at the growth curves, up until they're about 28% fat, they're still putting on a good amount of muscle. Muscle growth continues until maturity, and, the protein accretion slows down as they get closer to being finished or reach that, fat endpoint that we're targeting. But they still are putting on muscle, and that's quite a large amount of muscle when they're smaller. They'll try to enter the feed yard between 700 and 800 pounds or 850 pounds whenever they go into those feed yards. They're still putting on a lot of muscle, and our, cattle, they're getting slaughtered at, 1,350, 1,400 pounds. So there's a long period of growth that they're putting on a lot of muscle.
Okay, so now to the forage systems. We have cool season, we have warm season, we've got annuals, we got perennials, we've got grasses, legumes, forbs, we've got natives, we've got introduced species, and I think you've got all of them in Oklahoma. Is that correct?
Yes, we do. The eastern part of the state is a mixture of introduced warm season grasses, introduced cool season grasses, and then in certain locations, tallgrass prairie, which is native forage, that was the historic forage that was located here. In the western part of the state, it starts getting away from those more rain intensive or precipitation intensive type introduced forages. There's some introduced blue stems that are grown quite a bit, but it gets into a lot of native range. But that's also where predominantly our cool season annuals, wheat is the primary one, and it's in central and western Oklahoma as we go further west. So in eastern Oklahoma, the cropping systems don't rely on wheat as the primary cash crop, but as we go further west, they do. So lots of annuals used in eastern Oklahoma as cover crops, but it's not a cash crop, and those cover crops are grazed by livestock. As we get into central and western Oklahoma, where wheat is the primary cash crop, we've got the opportunity to use that in kind of a double cropping system where cattle graze that wheat pasture during the fall and early spring. And if we pull those cattle off from wheat pasture before it goes reproductive, starts joining out and trying to set grain, about the end of February, 1st of March, then we can graze that, remove the cattle, and still harvest a grain crop from that. So this mixed system, diversified system of cropping and livestock is a great opportunity for the farmers of this state, especially in western Oklahoma, where we can't historically grow a lot of corn or a lot of those other cash grain crops. So, that diversified cropping and livestock system is a hallmark of Oklahoma agriculture, and that's in western and central Oklahoma. Eastern Oklahoma, we can grow a lot of legumes and clovers and alfalfa. There's a good bit of alfalfa production in western Oklahoma as well. It's deep rooted and doesn't mind drier climates too. So we have a very diverse forage climate because we're in, like I said, we're in that transition zone going from the humid east into the arid west. And the forage systems that we can produce on one side of the state are nothing similar to that we can grow on the other side of the state.
And also, so the question of cool season versus warm season grasses.
The cool season perennials, and in the case of Oklahoma and the Southeastern United States, we're talking tall fescue. They primarily don't start growing until we hit I-35 and move east. There are areas in central Oklahoma, highly fertile bottom ground, where we can grow tall fescue. But as we move further east and get into higher rainfall areas, it becomes quite predominant. In eastern Oklahoma, most of those pastures with tall fescue we'll also have Bermuda grass and other warm season grasses as well. So they kind of naturally grow in mixtures. But that gives a really nice, nearly year-round forage base for cattle production.
Because the cool seasons will grow earlier in the spring than the warm seasons, slow down in the summer when the warm seasons really grow, and then maintain some growth into the fall when maybe the first frost would have hit some of the warm seasons. Is that accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. In southeastern Oklahoma, which is very close to where I was in southwestern Arkansas, we can start getting tall fescue growth where we could start grazing, mid to late October. And the warm season grasses, in many cases, will grow up until early to mid October. So, we'll have grazing of the warm season grasses from May all the way through October. In a good year, we would have grazing of the cool season perennials from October, early November into December. And then just during December and January, we may not have a growing forage crop. So those forages, just kind of work together naturally to create, productive grazing for about 10 months out of the year if it's well managed and fertilized.
And it would be possible, perhaps, even though the forage isn't growing, to still have some stockpile kind of a grazing system, or you'd be feeding hay, correct?
Yes. So we worked on research while I was in Arkansas, and we're doing some similar demonstrations of this concept to where we stockpiled some Bermuda grass to use during the late fall, and then we stockpiled some tall fescue to utilize through December into January. With that, in a cow-calf system, using rotational grazing and strip grazing of our stockpiled forages, we were able to have 365-day grazing. A couple of the years, we only fed hay for about 2 weeks out of the year. And in a lot of cases in that same region, there are producers that are feeding hay for about 4 months out of the year. So, stockpiling is, it sounds complicated. It's really just a simple concept of reserving fresh forage growth during the fall to utilize, later on in the year when it wouldn't normally be present. I put together some data looking at the reported hay production by the USDA over the last 40 years. And the hay production really took off about 1976, whenever Vermeer invented the round baler. And it became a lot handier to bale hay. There was a lot less hand labor to do that. And, just to look at that, the chart, it's just been a, steady linear increase ever since. And just more and more of this hay gets put up, and it doesn't last very long if you don't store it inside. So every bit of that hay that gets baled increases every year. It has to be fed. So we're taking a forage crop that, if we utilize it standing but let the cow do the harvesting, it's a cheap, economical nutrition source for the cow. And we're putting a lot of money into equipment and fertilizer to cut it, package it, and then refeed it to the cow later. So stockpiling is one of those ways that we can decrease the amount of hay that's fed. It's just so easy to get out there on a tractor and cut, rake, and bale hay all summer just so that we can, put it back out to the cows all winter.
Well, one, we have this increase in the amount of hay being put up, but I don't think we're seeing that dramatic increase in the number of cows to be fed, which is interesting. And then number two, I remember Dr. Kallenbach saying something like he was describing Missouri as a recreational haymaking state.
I would never be brave enough to say this, but we had a speaker at a field day a few years ago, said, the reason why we bale so much hay, and people were asking, he goes, no, because we don't want to spend that much time with our wife. So.
Okay. I think that when Rob gave that quote, he was saying that maybe half the hay that gets made never gets fed for one reason or another. It's stored improperly, so we have large storage losses. It's fed improperly, so we have large feeding losses, or it was never needed in the first place. And so it just sits there. So what does it cost to make a ton of hay?
Yeah, it's about $45 a ton, or $45 a bale. So that's about $90 a ton.
And the feed that you feed, the hay that you feed is never going to be better or as good as the forage crop you cut to bale. And it was probably a little over mature when you cut it. So maybe if you had grazed it earlier, you'd have gotten more value in terms of animal performance out of it. So it's
absolutely.
It's a system that needs to be re-examined, and we certainly, as you were saying earlier, with temporary fencing or the new technologies that are available, certainly within the last couple decades, there are options now that wouldn't have been available, say, half a century ago. Yeah, maybe it's getting close to that now. To American livestock producers back in, say, the 60s and 70s. But you've also worked with forage crops, which, again, annuals, but planted specifically to be grazed. So things like brassicas and maybe even some of the warm season annual grasses.
Yes. We've done, or I've done throughout my career, we looked at a lot of those in Arkansas, just planting CoolSeason annuals, utilizing those to have a green growing crop to graze throughout the winter in Arkansas. And one of the things we looked at was interseeding into Bermuda grass. There's a lot of Bermuda grass that, it's a great forage base. It starts growing in most parts of the South, end of April, 1st of May, and it produces well through the summer, especially when we get rain and with fertilizer, and then going all the way into October. And if we with the no-till drill technology, if we could graze that off or cut it for hay and remove most of the residue at the end of the growth phase, 1st of October, we can interseed or no-till drill CoolSeason annuals into those Bermuda grass fields. And then in a lot of cases, start grazing those in December. These annuals, warm season annuals and CoolSeason annuals are very productive. They're very high in quality, high in digestibility. So they're supplying a lot of, calories for the cow. The CoolSeason annuals are very high in protein. So, 25 to 30% crude protein in the late fall and through the winter. And then whenever they start going more reproductive in the spring, they'll still be about 20% crude protein. A growing calf only requires about 12 to 14% crude protein, depending on how big they are. So, and a beef cow, she only needs about 8 to 12% crude protein. If she's lactating and producing a lot of milk, we're looking at 10 to 12% crude protein. So a lot more protein in those annuals than what's actually needed. So we've used those as a supplement for lower quality forages on a beef cow, by letting her into those paddocks that we planted into CoolSeason annuals for just a few hours, 8 hours every third day or every other day would supply a lot more protein and energy than what she'd need to maintain body condition, along with some either stockpiled Bermuda grass or low quality hay. So decreasing the need for concentrate type supplements delivered to the cow. We've also, the WarmSeason annuals are a great resource in a diversified cropping and livestock system, or if we could interseed those. We've tried interseeding those into Bermuda grass as well, and it actually does work. Getting in a little bit before the Bermuda grass starts growing and planting those, so it adds some productivity to those types of systems. Right now, we've got a lot of interest in you used the term earlier, regenerative agriculture, and cover crops are getting to have a lot of press for using in cash cropping type systems. And I wasn't really interested in that very much until we started getting a lot of more questions about grazing. And then whenever people started talking about grazing cover crops, that I became a lot more interested. And, for those, it's more than just that wheat pasture that I talked about earlier. They're looking at different cereal grains, oats, triticale, rye, the brassicas, the turnips and the radishes and rape and kale and those types of things. And putting those into those mixtures for the agronomic benefits to the system, but all of those are very high quality grazing crops. And, there's some tricks. Some of those, the brassicas especially, cattle like to graze grass. They are resistant to a lot of those brassica type crops until they're exposed to them, and then once they realize they're edible, they will start grazing them. And usually that's after the frost, whenever the sugars start increasing. Some of the other really neat things in this cover cropping is for our wheat producing area. We had just a tillage type fallow system on our continuous wheat, and they would just start, after wheat harvest, start plowing and continue plowing all summer, keeping a denuded, basically just dirt field out there all summer. This leads to all types of erosion, the need for terracing. And then no-till agriculture came in, and it works well, but for no-till to work, don't have that tillage tool to take care of our weed problems, we need to have a rotation. And that's where a lot of these cover crops for summer cover crops have replaced that summer fallow, and they're planting mixtures that include beans and sun hemp, different types of beans, soybeans, mung beans, cowpeas, utilizing okra, along with the Sudans and sorghums. And it's surprising to me, and it surprises me every time I see it. But when we turn cattle onto those cover crops, They will, of course, start grazing what they're familiar with, the grasses, the sorghums, and the Sudans, and some of the millets. And then they discover the beans. And then all of a sudden, all of the okra is gone. You cannot find an okra in the field. And it's shocking that, it takes a while, and it almost follows that exact same pattern. Every time you turn cattle into one of these during the summer and graze these cover crop blends, once they discover that okra is a edible crop, they just go seek it out and find every bit of it. So there's cattle are not familiar with these plants, and once they're exposed to them, there's a learning curve, and it's enjoyable to watch that learning process and then their behaviors whenever they've figured it out.
I've joked for some time that there are two suitable uses for kale. One is as garnish and one is as forage. And maybe now I found the appropriate use for okra. I've heard it said, and certainly maybe more with beef cattle than with dairy cattle, under modern sort of North American and probably European systems. But we're feeding the microorganisms to feed the cow. There is some bypass material. So, but is that maybe a sound way to look at it with beef cattle, that we're worried about providing energy and rumen degradable protein so that the microorganisms can function effectively?
Absolutely. The whole reason for cattle is to take forage crops that humans can't use and turn that into an edible product. And that the reason why they can do it is because of the rumen, and it's just a big fermentation vat, and it's full of billions of microbes that break the fiber material down from these grazed forages. And the byproduct from their fermentation is the energy, and whenever they reproduce, these microbes provide the protein to the cow when it goes cycling onto the lower gut. So for the beef cattle to be productive and digest that fiber, we've got to meet the requirements of those microbes first. And, if one of the classic examples in Oklahoma is on our tallgrass prairies in, eastern Oklahoma, primarily eastern and central Oklahoma, very productive native range type ecosystem. During the early summer, it's, high in energy, high in digestibility, and, high in protein. But when we get to July, those plants evolved to be reproductive after about the middle of July. And if they get a rain in July, or some of our other types of plants, or western type range plants, or our Bermuda grasses, they'll start growing leaf and produce a high quality, more high quality forage. That tallgrass prairie in the late summer is reproductive. It's just stems and seed heads, and that's the production of during the late summer. So it's low in protein and low in digestibility. That protein is insufficient for the microbes to digest fiber. And, one of the classic supplementation programs developed here in Oklahoma, they call it the Oklahoma Gold Program for marketing reasons, is feeding 1 pound of a high protein supplement, and it will increase gains by about a half pound a day, because it's meeting the requirements of the rumen microbes for nitrogen. It speeds up the digestion of those low quality range plants, increases intake, and increases the passage rate out of the rumen. So, just meeting the requirements of the rumen for rumen degradable protein, and it's just nitrogen. It's all those proteins are broken down into a carbon structure and the nitrogen. The microbes use that nitrogen from that protein supplement. And, so that's the classic example of the deficiency in the rumen and how that can impact, digestibility of the grass and performance of the animal.
And one of the many unique features of a rumen compared to monogastrics is it's not a flow-through system. It has to be broken down mechanically and through the activity of the microorganisms broken down small enough to pass out of the rumen. So if we fill the rumen with poorly digestible material, it's going to be a while before there's room in the inn for the next guests to arrive.
Yeah, output has to happen before more input can occur, for sure. To me, it's a very interesting system. And, everything has to fit together for that beef cow to operate.
And we talk frequently about why ruminants rule and that key link between the conversion of cellulose into fat and muscle in the case of when fed to ruminants, where we can't use that directly, but fortunately they're that key link in the food chain. So let's see, we've talked about a lot of these things. What's the extension service? We had Jimmy Henning on, and he spoke about it, but I spent a little time in it, and I'm, I guess, surprised by the number of people that don't know what it is. So why should people know about it? How could they get in touch with it?
So in Oklahoma and Arkansas as well, which are and I believe in Texas it's still the case. So the states I'm most familiar with, one of the reasons why everybody should know about the Extension Service is because they have a presence in every county of those states. And that's not necessarily true for all states, but there are local offices available. And as Extension, we provide science-based information to stakeholders, whether it be a farmer, a gardener, or somebody canning or just trying to cook and prepare meals for their family, without the bias of having a product to sell. So it's a service. It was, one of the key elements in the cooperative extension is cooperative extension service. And, most of our programs are, extremely moderately priced or free information for those that need it and know to ask. So that's one of the reasons why, everybody should be aware of the cooperative extension service. We don't have anything to sell. We're trying to give away our information, I was thinking about a lot of my theory classes on extension education. It was important enough, the land grant colleges, it was important enough to the founding legislation was done during the Civil War. So there's this big, thing happening, but, the Congress and our, representatives knew it was important enough to develop this system, even though all this stuff is going on. And basically it created the land grant colleges, which there's, in every state. There is a one or two land grant universities. And, that created the three-stool mission of the land grant colleges is research to develop, new ways to produce food and utilize it to the best of our ability, teach the next generation of people that will become our stakeholders. And then extension was the third equal leg of that stool. And, one of the things that separates United States agriculture from many of the other production systems in the world is extension. We are available to advise, crop producers, livestock producers, and teach them new and more productive ways to do their job, which is producing food to feed not just the United States or Oklahoma, but to feed the world.
And the two-way exchange of information. So there are advisory boards, or that may not be the right description, but from the local areas, people are able to voice concerns, identify problems that can get communicated up to the university. If somebody comes up with a problem, all of a sudden they're tapped into a national, or in some cases international, community of people who study that potential problem, and maybe an answer could come, or maybe that could guide some new research.
It's not a one-size-fit-all type program. We have a local presence, across Oklahoma, and what works in rural northwest Oklahoma or the Oklahoma Panhandle is not going to be what works in Oklahoma City. In Oklahoma, County, Oklahoma, where Oklahoma City is, there are still some farms left in that county, but it's predominantly urban, and but what works there may not work in Tulsa, or other major metropolitan areas. So that local stakeholder involvement is the key to set the agenda and the focus for each individual area of the state. So that's an important part of extension, and delivering that service to the clientele isn't very useful if we're not supplying what they need and what they want.
And so you're trained as an animal scientist. What's with specialty in beef cattle? What sorts of subject or careers could come out of someone studying animal science? Or maybe if somebody was wanting to go online and look up journals that are available to the public to read, what sorts of information might they find if they start scanning the stacks, so to speak, when we used to do that physically in libraries?
So, to me, animal science is most simple way to explain it is it's applied biology. In the animal science departments, across the United States, there are, dairy specialists. There are companion animal specialists, that focus on dogs and cats and their nutrition or management and equine, specialty and all that. But within each one of those, there are meat scientists that focus on the fabrication of meat and meat quality. There are reproductive specialists that start, at the beginning of the production chain, that looking at getting animals to cycle and to rebreed and to be more productive, reproductive. Then there's, there's genetics, and there's as many different areas of focus in animal science as there are areas of, biology. We have careers as we're looking at the current students in our animal science departments, the interest in production agriculture is getting to be less and less. People going back to the farm is no longer, what we do as far as training. And we are training, people to go back and be farm managers and to be, agricultural producers. And that's going to be a key forever for our departments. But many of our undergrads are, wanting to get into vet school to become veterinarians. There's jobs in feed sales and forage companies, sales. There's a lot of our animal science graduates that become bankers and ag lenders, and it's there's as many different jobs coming out of animal science departments as there are, business jobs, coming out of business school. So it's just impossible to put your mind around, I'm a cowboy. The Oklahoma States, they're the cowboys, and I was raised on a ranch, and that's kind of my focus. But there's as many different other careers, in animal science that, we try to get our students to take internships and look at other areas, and you don't know what you want to do until you've experienced a lot of these things. So animal science is a huge career, and we've got quite a few of our graduates go into medical school and other different types of programs you don't normally associate with just a bunch of Aggies. So
I'm smiling because I want to see what happens when someone who's well trained in animal nutrition gets into medical school and goes, "What?" But that's for another day. And of course, one of the things that we have ahead of us, this occurred to me as I prepared a lecture, remote, of course, for a forages class, was we keep hearing these by 2050 sort of goals for sustainable development in around the world. And I realized, okay, that's these students' professional lifetimes. That's only 30 years from now. So
absolutely.
And there's absolutely things that can be done today to take what we know from here and appropriately leverage that into other parts of the world to improve productivity, efficiency, which will lower impact, raise standard of living for producers, provide the food stuff that people need there. And we can do it while we protect and enhance the environment in which it's taking place. So
those population growth numbers, I see a lot of growth in, Dallas and down through Waco into Austin, and Oklahoma City is expanding, and Tulsa's growing. And, those are, in those particular instances, part of the most productive agricultural parts of those states. In Oklahoma, that area around Oklahoma City where the urban growth is occurring, are some very highly productive farmland. And you see that in just area after area. And it's not just the big cities that are growing. So along with the population growth, we're going to increase, we have a growing middle class around the world. They're going to want to consume more animal products because that's the next logical step. We get more money, we want to eat better. And that's, in my mind, a beef related diet, but, I guess we could, say pork and chicken as well. But so there's never been a time where the research and the extension efforts and the education coming out of our colleges of agriculture were more important than now. They were essential, back in the mid 1800s. They were essential, when Smith-Lever Act, in 1914, and they're just as important now as they ever were. And there's research and there's, extension activities that have got to remain active, and they're important, and we need to be, focused on those areas where we can increase efficiency, decrease our impact on the environment along with that.
Well, thanks again for spending time and going over some things. And I know that there's a great deal more depth to everything that we could have gone into, but kind of maybe an introductory of an appetizer, if you will, and we might come back for a later serving. It's fair. I've asked you a bunch of questions. If you'd like to ask me a question or two, that would only be fair.
So, I've seen you speak on several times on the health qualities of a meat related diet, increasing meat. How are you? What's your perception of people's take home from that? You've mentioned to me you've lectured to audiences full of doctors and dietitians. How are people taking that, and what's their take home from that? And do you think, how can we help you improve the reach of your message?
Good questions. One, I think that hearing someone say or just describe what actually happens in current production systems, because agriculture, I don't think, has done a good job of talking about ecosystem services as well as modern practices. And so what people know is only what they've heard. And frequently there's misunderstanding. So it helps to have people information and then introduce people to the sources of that information. So continue in what you're doing. The audience is bigger than you know. But maybe we need to work on better ways to get that information, because we've got very loud, very well-financed voices against animal agriculture. So I think somebody put it recently that, eating red meat, you're going to kill yourself. And then by producing it, you're going to kill everybody else, right? That message that's out there. And being able to tell people, relax, you're not going to destroy the planet. And then here are all these physicians that say you're not going to kill yourself. Okay, that helps. I think that we have a lot of distance to make up yet. We're several decades behind in this race. But I think that more and more information is coming to light, pointing to what I think is some very good news about reversing chronic diseases and allowing people to live without the need for ongoing medication, which sort of is at least is a potential. So that's good news. And then I think also the good news that properly managed ruminant animal agriculture is an essential part of sustainable food systems. And we just have to get better at talking about that. So more people understand it's not either or. We have to have both. And I think today, too frequently, we devolve into the us and them, the either or kind of thing. And so I sense that more and more people are becoming aware of the things that I've been talking about and learning about for the last over a decade. And hopefully, in some way, we can all contribute to that process on a growing scale.
Another question I have that I've wanted to hear what your thoughts are on this concept is lab-grown meat. Where does it fit in? Will it make an impact? And is it really better, healthier, more sustainable?
Well, yeah. So I'll start off by saying just because we can doesn't mean we should. Um, I'll follow that with the point that so many of the arguments for it are based on flawed worldviews and narratives. And so then their justifications are also flawed. Um, they're not making a product that's going to fit the people that don't want to eat animal source food, right? Because their argument is it is animal source food.
Right.
The logistics of it, I'm not certain, but I think I've read some things that seem to indicate that you're really going to have to do a lot to maintain sterility in these systems, and that won't come without a cost. I'll add the point about where do the resources come from that are going to be used to grow this. I'll move on to exactly what is it you're growing? Which part of an animal are you? Because not all meat is the same. And so much of this is based on the idea that fat is bad. So we'll produce this lean protein. And my point is, what happens if it turns out that animal fat is not bad? And what about all the other nutrients that come along with it? It's not just protein, it's all these others. So you're not, there's several flaws in their argument. And I guess to wrap it up, I'll just have one word: margarine.
Yeah.
Have we recovered from margarine yet? And that was supposed to be this engineered replacement for butter. And why was that? Well, because butter was bad for you. Well, not so fast. Maybe butter isn't bad for you. Maybe, in fact, margarine is worse for you than butter.
Yeah.
So those are the things that cycle through my mind whenever the subject of lab-grown meat comes up.
And um, I I think whenever we really do the analysis, if this is a replacement for, you animal agriculture, there's still going to be, you know, the need for those ecosystem services provided by grazing livestock.
Yes.
So it's not going to replace that need environmentally for, animal agriculture.
Well, yeah, somebody described beef cows as self-locomotive, self-locomoting, self-replicating, self-loading, solar-powered anaerobic fermentation vessels or something like that. I mean, takes all the romance right out of it. But you've got the system where the the methane and the CO2 that's emitted by the animal is coming from fixed carbohydrate that was the process of photosynthesis. So it's a cycling of CO2. The methane that's emitted is oxidized in about 10 years to CO2. So we've got this cycling. All of these systems where they're going to manufacture a food-like substance is going to be driven by electrical power, by fossil fuels. That's an enrichment of CO2 into the atmosphere, because it's the burning of these fossil fuels producing CO2 rather than the cycling. Um, and there's lots we could talk about there, but again, that just speaks to me of their flawed sort of models. And depending on how you construct the models, you can come to whatever answer you'd like. And I think we're seeing a lot of that in this.
Yeah, the quality of modeling data is just as good as the person designing the equations to calculate it. So if you have a preconceived notion and know which way you want your model to turn out, you can force it that direction as well. So.
Yeah, and I mean, to be fair and open, I'm an agriculturalist. I have my bias and my perspective, um, and I'm pretty open about it. I just think that, what is it, 20 million years since all of the current ruminant families are, or at least ruminants were present in the record. I mean, that's a long time to work on perfecting a system. And it seems like in its wisdom, we've been provided with that system. And now in our hubris, we're going to come along and say, oh, well, we can replace, we know how to do this. And of course, this is a system that will be controlled by even fewer people than currently impact the current system. And so I that's another reason in my mind for some suspicion and skepticism, and perhaps a little reluctance, or at least let's take this one a little slower and be sure that we're fully examining it.
Yeah, that's good points. I've just been reading some on that, and I was like, well, I've got Peter here, and he asked if I had any questions for him, because I've been kind of wanting to hear your thoughts.
Fair enough. And anytime you'd like, I'd be happy to share some stuff that's been accumulating in my EndNote collection. Well, thank you, Paul. Appreciate the time. Whenever we can visit again, I look forward to it. It won't be at Toadsuck Bucks, though. That's unfortunate.
Toadsuck Bucks, huh?
Yeah. I remember fondly a visit to the Arkansas Forage and Grassland meeting, and I was treated to a night at
in Conway, Toadsuck. I'd forgotten about that. That's a classic.
Yes, it's a cultural icon. I've gotten to visit many of them around the country. I really enjoy that part of it.
Well, if you make it back to Arkansas, I'll find a way to get there myself, and we will take some time at Toadsuck Bucks.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Happy holidays.
Thank you, and happy holidays to you as well, Peter. And I really appreciate the invitation to talk to you. And whenever you initially invited me and said, well, we're going to talk for an hour and a half or so, and I thought, well, there's no way I can talk for that long. But when it's talking to Peter Ballerstedt, you can find something to talk about for a lot longer than just an hour and a half. So,
thank you.